Today we're going to take a look at managing your web page layout using HTML and CSS. Let's start by taking a look at a couple of professional examples. Here we have the Yahoo Sports website homepage, and it's broken into a few areas. Up here you'll see is essentially what we consider the banner. It's a little more stuff than we would normally put in, but that is the banner area. Below that is a navigation broken into 2 rows. And then below that you have 2 portions of the main part of the site, what I might call the content here on the left, and then on the right what we might think of as a sidebar or an aside, which has some quick links and also maybe some advertisement. Again, we can see this here is the USA Gov homepage, and once again we'll see that there's the banner, there's some basic navigation, cleanly designed, and then they've got a slider, which we've seen before, which to the right of it has some quick links, and below that they have what I would consider the content section broken into multiple parts. You'll also note on the left and the right, which indicates a really contained design. A quick third example, same thing, contained, left and right. Notice how they're taking advantage of the background. Navigation up here, kind of combined with any banner in this case. And then area for a slider if they had one, a right column, and then maybe some main content area. I've also taken a shot here of the footer section of that page, and if you come down here you'll see really this is the footer section, and it contains all of the things that we'd want to see, basically in this case lots of copyrights for all the different things that you see on the LEGO websites. And so these are typical designs that really lead us to what we're going to do for our layout. So let's get started. You'll want to start by opening up Text Wrangler and a browser. Start with the basic code and then add in the following. Remember, you can pause this video at any time. Here I'm going to add in a div with an ID of container. This will envelop the entire content of my page. Within this, I'm going to add a new tag called header, which is where the banner will go. And then I'm going to add another tag called nav, which is where the navigation will go. Next, I'm going to add an aside, which will work as a sidebar on our page. Then I'm going to add a div with an ID of content for my main content on the page. And finally, I'm going to add in a footer to close out this section. Again, remember, you can pause this video any time or even rewind to catch up with any of the typing. Next, I'm just going to put in here some basic content so that as we look at the page in a browser, we can see what this looks like. I'm going to quickly add it all in, and then pause it, add it yourself, and then we'll move on. Now let's take a look at what this looks like in our browser. First, find the file, then double-click on the file to open it up in the browser. This will open in your default browser, or you can right-click and choose the browser of your choice. Notice how all of our content here is to the left and not really organized, just each section on its own line. What we're going to do now is add some CSS. Now again, I'm going to jump through this by adding all of the different sections of our page as selectors. So the first section is our container. Then I'm just going to quickly add these sections one at a time. You notice the header, and then we have the nav, and then we have the aside, the content area, and finally the footer. Now I'm going to start adding style to each of these sections. In this case, I'm just going to add a background color to each one. While it won't show up yet, it'll give us an opportunity to have something that's already in place as we start checking what does our design look like in the browser and what have we added in the CSS and HTML. So I'm going to add a black background to the container, and then I'm going to add a white background to every other section. As I said, when we take a look at this in the browser, we won't see any change yet, but in our next section, the change will certainly start to appear. Please be sure to pause the video now so that you can catch up with all of your code. Now things are going to get a little more interesting. We're going to start adding several styles to each section, and I'm going to start with the container. We're going to define the width of the container as 1,000 pixels. This is a common width for many websites. Then we're going to add a little bit of margin to manage so that this is our centering instruction. So we set it to 0 and auto, and notice how it moves over. It doesn't appear to be quite in the middle, but if we look at it with the border around it, which I'm going to set at solid, light gray, and 3 pixels, then you'll see that indeed the box is centered. Next, we'll move on to the header. And in the header, we're going to very simply define a height of 150 pixels. We don't normally need to define a height, but in this case, we're not putting an actual banner in, so we're going to define it. And we're also going to give it a little bit of a margin. And that margin allows the black background of the container to show through. Next, we'll move to the nav. Only add a margin here. We're not going to add any height. Notice how the navigation appears. And now things are going to get a little more interesting. In the aside, we're going to go ahead and set a width of only 180 pixels. It's a skinny column that we're adding. We're also going to define the width for the content to make up the majority of the excess, 811 pixels, because we want these two sections side by side. Notice they're not yet side by side, so we're going to go back to the aside, give it a height. Since we have no content to actually put into it, we'll let our defined height be 475 pixels, just for illustration. And we're going to go in and move it to the right. And to do that, we're going to do float right. This will mess up our height temporarily, but don't fear, we're going to fix that. Then we're going to move down to the content area, and we're going to define here the height of this as well at 475 pixels, and we'll give it a margin of 3 pixels. This will get us pretty close to what we want. Notice the aside isn't quite there yet. So we're going to squeeze that in a little better to make it look like everything else. And all we have to do is give the aside a margin on the right of 3 pixels. And once we do that, everything comes into nice balance, leaving only the footer for us to style. With the footer, we're just going to change it up a little bit. And we don't need to define much, but we're going to change the background to black. And we're going to add the color. So this changes the text to white. So we'll do a white on black. Notice how that pops a little differently down there. And then finally, we'll just put a touch of padding around it so that the text isn't rubbing right up against the side. And now we've completed our layout. And it's looking pretty good. Look at all the sections are laid out. We can add content as we want. What I want to do is come back up here and actually give a little bit of color to the body, so that instead of a white background, I'm going to change the background color to gray. And in this case, I'm going to use a 888 color for the background. And again, it just separates our content and really defines, look at that box as it sits against the background. From here, we can get much fancier, and I'm sure we will when we add in Photoshop and other elements. And that concludes our notes on web page layout with HTML and CSS. Please review frequently and manage your awesome web pages.